Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Look Ahead Post-Election Insights from NFP Experts. This is part one of a three-part series with the remaining calls happening next week on the 7th and the 8th. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to let you know that we are recording this session, and the recording will be both distributed to attendees via email, as well as available through our normal communication channels. As you have questions, you may post them in the Zoom Q&A located at the bottom of your screen, and we will address the questions at the end of the call. If we're unable to address your question today, please email learning@nfp.com, and it will be routed to the appropriate party. At this time, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker for today's webinar, Eric Baster, Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning and welcome everybody to the first NFP webinar in a three-part post-election series designed to shape perspectives on how election results may affect clients, both corporate and individuals. Today, we're very lucky to have Admiral James Stavridis, an NFP board member and go-to expert on topics across the political and economic spectrum with us. He will share his uniquely informed insights on the global landscape through the lens of the election results. As Matt said, we have two other seminars coming up next week on December 7th at 11:30 a.m. We'll host our second webinar in this series, The Impact on Your Business, covering topics in benefits, retirement, and property and casualty, where we'll have NFP's Suzanne Spradley moderate a discussion on how the election outcome may affect how companies support their employees and protect their businesses. Areas that we will discuss on that call cover potential executive orders in the first 100 days, what to expect from the U.S. Senate in terms of healthcare legislation, employment laws that may be impacted, perspective following oral arguments in California versus Texas, the Supreme Court case involving the ACA's individual mandate, and updates on COVID-related stimulus relief. Then on December 8th at 11 a.m. Eastern, we will host our final webinar in this series, focused on our individual clients, empowering certainty with sound planning, where Mike James, head of NFP's Individual Solutions, will host a call with our leading experts in the wealth management and life insurance and estate planning space. Now, a little background on our speaker today, Admiral James Stavridis. He was the 16th Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and was vetted for a vice president spot by Hillary Clinton and subsequently offered a cabinet post by the Trump administration. Today, the Admiral's comments will include a near-term outlook and key factors to consider as 2021 approaches. Admiral, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, everybody, and a warm welcome, particularly to my colleagues at NFP. I'm very proud to be on the board of such a terrific corporation, and I was very pleased to be asked to share some thoughts about what's going to unfold both geopolitically in the world and kind of in leadership as we have this new Biden team on deck. So I'm going to show a few images, really just photographs to kind of move the conversation along. And then we'll open it up for comments and discussion. So let me begin with a photograph. And you're looking at that thinking, okay, that's one of these pop-up hospitals, maybe in Central Park from last summer. No, that photograph was taken over 100 years ago. That's a ward during the time of Spanish influenza. And if you're not aware of these numbers, listen closely. Spanish influenza ultimately infected 40% of the world's population. It had a mortality rate of 20%. Those are staggering numbers. And I put the photograph here and I tell you those numbers to give us a sense of perspective that we will get through this, that the current COVID crisis, and it is a crisis, is terrible. But we have been through pandemics before. About every 100 to 200 years in human history, we see an event like this, and we will get through this one as we have other ones. And you don't have to go back 100 years ago. We faced Ebola, that's the Ebola pathogen at the top. Upper right is patient 0, Ebola, who died here in the United States at a Dallas hospital, and Zika along the bottom. These are both pathogens, lethal ones, frightening ones, but collectively we are able to work through these. And we're seeing much hopeful news, as we all know, over the last few weeks, with the potential for very good results on vaccines, and deliveries, frankly, going to start this month. So we will get through this despite all of the challenges. The problem with COVID in many ways has been we don't know exactly where it fits on a graph like this. So on the left axis is lethality. The higher the number, the greater the level of lethality. So you see bird flu, Ebola, MERS way up there. Spanish flu, as I mentioned, about a 20% lethality. And seasonal flu down toward the bottom, common cold all the way down. No one dies of cold. Where exactly we are going to find a COVID lands on this grid, I think, is going to be above seasonal flu, obviously, but well below Spanish flu. It'll probably be in the 1 to 3% range. Lethal, but not as bad as some of the other pathogens I've mentioned. And along the bottom axis is transmissibility, how likely you are to contract it from being around others. Look at measles all the way over on the right. Basically, if you have measles and you look at somebody else, they'll get measles. Chickenpox, highly transmissible. Where's coronavirus? Again, probably somewhere between seasonal flu, not as perhaps as transmissible as polio. In any event, coronavirus is sort of settling in, if you will, in the lower left-hand corner of that tan box. And that's a good place for it to be. And I think we'll do reasonably well as we make the turn out of this. And let's face it, it's going to be a 6-month period till the US is fully inoculated, probably a year till that transmits globally. So thinking of normality is probably about a year away, but it's going to feel better and different as we get into the spring. Now, all of that creates a lot of change, but how about this? We've got a new administration about to take power, and I know all the people on this graph extremely well. They're all close personal friends. I worked with all of them extensively during the Obama administration when I was Supreme Allied Commander, and they all held cabinet or near cabinet level jobs. You probably recognize most of them, but that's Tony Blinken, upper left, who's our next Secretary of State, assuming confirmation. Below Tony is Michelle Flournoy, still, I think, the leading contender to be the Secretary of Defense, although there are some good candidates in the mix. Bottom center is a woman named Avril Haines, former deputy at the CIA. She's going to be our Director of National Intelligence. Bottom right, literally, as we are doing this webinar, the president-elect is formally announcing something we've known for about a week, that Janet Yellen will be his Treasury Secretary. I think she's a terrific pick. She's a walking resume for the job. Upper right, you may not know Lisa Monaco. She was the National Security Advisor for Homeland Security. She will certainly get a significant role in the Homeland Security and intelligence community, potentially. So I put them here. I could have put another 20 faces up there simply to make the point. It's a new team, but it's a very well-known team. And they're not only very experienced, but I will tell you, they also are extremely collegial. They work together well. They can finish each other's sentences. It's a no drama kind of team, which I think is something the nation is looking for at this point. So we have these two events going on, if you will, COVID, the pandemic, and a new administration here in the US. So right about now, you ought to be saying, well, okay, Admiral, what do you think? How's it going to come out? What can you tell us about the geopolitics of this moment and about this new leadership team? So let me do a bit of both. Let me start, however, by showing you what is not going to happen, which a year ago, as we kind of got into the pandemic, we really weren't sure what we were going to be dealing with globally. But I think it's clear now that we're not going to see this. We're not going to see a global meltdown as a result of a pandemic. Now, I don't know if you've seen this movie, World War Z, not Brad Pitt's finest work, but it is about a pandemic, and it's about a world order that falls apart. It happens to be a zombie pandemic, kind of preposterous biologically, but many of the provisions of it, many of the edges of the story are similar. We're not going to end up with this kind of chaotic set of outcomes, but we are going to see some winners and some losers coming out of the pandemic geopolitically. And let's start with China. China will come out a winner. China has used authoritarian tools very effectively to contain the virus. They will see a V-shaped recovery. They will use this period of time to advance their Belton Road initiative. And I think overall, China will come out in a stronger geopolitical position. And, you know, that's going to be difficult for the United States because of this basket of complicated, difficult issues between the United States and China. Upper left, we're already in a kind of shadowy cyber conflict with China. Upper right, those are Chinese ballistic missile submarines. We see China expanding their military and in particular their Navy. Bottom right, trade and tariff disagreements well known. Bottom left, you may not recognize. This is an artificial island. China is building these all over the South China Sea. And they're doing so because they claim the South China Sea as territorial waters. It's a preposterous claim under international law, but in order to buttress that claim, they're building artificial islands, typically on top of coral reefs. They built 9 of these already. And it's a significant disagreement between China, all of the nations around the South China Sea, and in particular the United States of America, because we have always been strong proponents of freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation. And then in the center, of course, is the whole, it's 5G and the controversy there over Huawei potentially dominating that space, but it's the larger question of the footprint in the cyber sphere. So all of these, if you will, conditions pre-existed before we had COVID. China's got a strategy that is going to be strengthened as they come out of COVID. Their strategy is this. It's called One Belt, One Road. Sometimes it's called the Belton Road Initiative, BRI. You'll see that as well. It's really got 2 parts to it. A northern overland trade route, and on the bottom, a maritime arm to it. And over both of these routes, the idea is that China will export finished goods and import raw materials. It's a smart strategy. It's well thought out. It's historically grounded. And they will continue to press it. And they're going to use all of the tools at their disposal, including, for example, cyber. As I mentioned before, China is very adept in the cyber world. This is a photograph taken of the Chinese cyber force. By the way, China has, like the United States, an army, an air force, a Marine Corps, a Coast Guard, and a Navy. China also has a cyber force, a dedicated branch of the armed forces that focuses on cyber, and it's very skilled. And I'll give you a practical example of how skilled it is. China was able to obtain the stealth characteristics of that fighter at the top. That's an F-35 Lightning, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world today, a so-called 5th generation fighter, F-35. Look at the one on the bottom. That's a Chinese J-22. It's an exact copy. And it is an exact copy because the stealth qualities and characteristics were hacked from Lockheed Martin. Another piece of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and strategy, as I mentioned earlier, is this, the South China Sea. Take a look at that body of water. That is huge physically. It's the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea combined. And again, China claims it as territorial waters, meaning that they would own all of the oil and gas that's underneath it, billions of barrels, trillions of cubic feet, and they would have, therefore, control over the shipping. 40% of the world's shipping goes through the South China Sea. So China will continue to claim it. And as I mentioned, upper right, they're building these artificial islands. If you want to see what one looks like when it's finished, it's at the bottom. It's an airstrips, it's got missile launchers, it's got radars, troops, tanks, airplanes come and go. In the Navy, we don't call these artificial islands. We call them unsinkable aircraft carriers, because that's how China would use them if, God forbid, we ended up in a conflict with China. And upper left, you see that red circle. That's where China is building these principally. They've built 9 so far. Think about 9 aircraft carriers operating together in a strategically vital space. That's another part of this strategy on the part of China. And then finally, China is drawing closer and closer to Russia. We never really saw this during the Cold War. The Soviet Union and Communist China, as we called them at one time, really were competing entities. Today, that's not the case. They have drawn quite close together. Bottom left, Chinese soldiers hugging Russian soldiers. You see their flags there. After the conclusion of the largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. It happened on the Siberian border, hundreds of thousands of troops from both nations involved. Bottom right, that's a Chinese frigate and a Russian destroyer operating together, not in the North Pacific, where you might expect that. They're operating together in the Baltic Sea, in the heart of Europe. They are drawing closer and closer together, again, part of China's very smart strategy. So how does it come out with the US and China over the next 10 to 20 years? We don't know. It could come out reasonably well. Here's a port visit by a Chinese destroyer, and look carefully upper left. That's the US flag. This is a Chinese ship pulling into Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. There are many reasons to believe the US and China can, over time, work closely together. On the other hand, could we stumble into a Cold War with China, or, God forbid, a real war? Upper right, my 10th book is a novel. It's called 2034, like the year 2034, a novel of the next world war. It talks about how we could stumble into a war with China. How's it going to come out? We don't know, but we do know coming out of COVID, China will be energized and more aggressive as it pursues its strategy. Where else shall we look around the world? Well, how about in Europe? We're going to see Brexit finally come to a conclusion after 3 to 4 years of turbulent events. No one knows yet whether it'll end up as a crash out or a negotiation. If you put a gun to my head, I'd say they probably will sign a last-minute deal. But the bottom line is the European project, if you will, the European Union coming out of this period is going to be diminished by the departure of Great Britain. It still will have important structural underpinnings like NATO, like the European Union itself. But coming out of COVID, I think that the European Union will be neutral to slightly diminished internationally, simply because of the same set of controversies we've dealt with here in the United States. Disagreements about mask wearing, difficulties in very liberal societies, constraining freedoms to deal with the pandemic. The good news for Europe is it's well led. The current leader of the European Union is a woman, Dr. Ursula von der Leyen. She is a physician. She was also the Minister of Defense of Germany when I was Supreme Allied Commander. I know her well. She's highly competent. And as many of you will know, Christine Lagarde, who ran the IMF, is now in Europe running the European financial structures, essentially. So there's good leadership, but they face challenges. I think Europe comes out, let's say, neutral coming out of this in terms of geopolitical influence. And then our two close neighbors to the north and south, Canada and Mexico, I think will follow a trajectory roughly alongside of the Europeans, which is to say they will have challenges, but will come out with their economies reasonably intact. The Canadians to the north, of course, very worried with a Biden administration about the future of the Keystone XL pipeline. Down in Mexico, you have ongoing concerns between their president, AMLO over there on the left, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and the issues surrounding the wall construction and so forth. So bit of bumpiness to the south, pretty smooth to the north, in the neutral range coming out of this in terms of geopolitical throw weight. Well, let me show you where I'm worried about, and that is the emerging markets, the developing world. That's India and Pakistan. The top is the Golden Temple of Amritsar, sacred to the Sikh faith. The bottom is Pakistan. I'm worried about sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm worried about Latin America, broadly speaking, particularly south of Mexico. All of these three zones, together collectively, by the way, about half the world's population, all three of them have, shall we say, less well-developed medical systems to respond to this. All of them have uneven levels of governance. All of them will face significant challenges in obtaining and distributing vaccine. So challenges for these three. Now, here's the good news for the developing world. It's a young population, very young. And that, as we know, is more youthful populations are less impacted by COVID. So that will be balanced by the difficulties in the medical system. In effect, you're going to see these three areas conduct a massive experiment in herd immunity, and we'll see how quickly they can be developed. I am worried about these three zones. The other positive, if you will, is that it's now heading into summer in all three of these regions. All three are below the equator, of course, or near it, and therefore are going to be going into the summer. That should diminish the effect somewhat. So it's a mixed picture in that massive developing world. In a better situation, the US and China would be working together, right, to be manufacturing and distributing vaccine to this part of the world, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it presents an opportunity for those two massive nations to keep their markets going. Well, how about Russia, that perennial bad boy of international relations? Russia will come out diminished. They have manufactured a vaccine. I'm not sure I would be standing in line to take the Russian vaccine. Their population is already declining, has many underlying conditions, alcoholism, drug abuse. Russia will find itself needing to draw closer to China. That'll be Russia's fate coming out of COVID. And then to close on kind of geopolitics and looking around the world, to say a word about Iran to the north and North Korea to the south. Iran is just holding its breath, waiting for the Biden administration. That's the only reason they have not already responded strongly and harshly, frankly, going back to January and the killing of General Soleimani, the leader of the Quds Force, their Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces, but more recently, of course, the killing of Dr. Stavridis, the nuclear scientist, Iran is waiting for Biden, and they are hoping they will get back to sanctions being lifted, back to the old Iranian nuclear deal. We'll see. In any event, picture them kind of on pause at the moment. And down at the bottom, North Korea, I think, unfortunately, we'll see Kim kind of decide he needs to do something dramatic to jump back into the mix internationally, perhaps to challenge the Biden administration early. So look for a nuclear, let's hope not a nuclear detonation, but certainly a large ballistic missile launch in the days immediately after the inauguration. So both of these nations will continue to be challenges. I don't think you'll see either of them move dramatically until after the Biden team comes in. Well, how about us? How about the United States? Unfortunately, we are going to come out in a diminished position geopolitically simply because we have mishandled the virus so terribly here in this nation. I'm going to attribute that to gridlock more than anything else. And by the way, Eric was pointed out that I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton. That's true. I was one of 6 people actually vetted. And I was I was offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump. I kind of pictured those 2 events as 2 bullets whizzing by my head. But I will tell you plainly that I am saddened by the gridlock in the nation, the way we've turned wearing a mask into a political statement. All of that has sent poor signals internationally. Our influence is diminished. Whether that can be regained under a Biden team, we'll know more in a year. But this essence of gridlock continues to plague the United States. And by the way, that adorable little girl on the bottom left is my granddaughter. She's 4 years old, and she knows to put on her Minnie Mouse mask when she goes outside. We need, I think, to overcome this gridlock more than anything else if we're going to play strongly in this international world. So that's a look at the national kind of challenges and how some of the geopolitics plays out. I'll throw out 2 other things that ought to concern us that have been off the radar over this year as we've dealt with the pandemic, but I think will come back on the radar. One is cyber, and that is blinking red right now. This is an area that I do a lot of work in. Upper left, hackivism, center at the top, crime, cyber criminal activity, upper right, national activity, again, the Chinese unit that does this. Cyber is getting ready to come bouncing back into our lives, unfortunately. And then secondly, we haven't talked much over the last year about climate. I'm encouraged by the Biden administration's decision to appoint former Secretary of State John Kerry to be a special envoy for climate. We need to continue to address this because the long-term challenges in climate are deep and significant. So that's a look at the geopolitics and the challenges. Let me talk now about leadership and some of the tools of leadership that I think you'll see on display from this Biden team. And, you know, whenever I talk about leadership, I like to go back to this great American leader. And we ought to kind of pause occasionally and look back on the life of FDR. And if you've never read a biography of FDR, this is one I would recommend by Gene Smith. You know, FDR faced challenges that dwarf anything President Trump is facing at the moment or that President Biden will face. Not only did he have the lingering effects of Spanish influenza pandemic, he had, of course, a massive global depression with a D and the attendant trade barriers that had been erected all around the world, followed by the rise of fascism and a massive Second World War that ultimately killed 50 million people. That is a serious basket of challenges. You'd have to go back to Lincoln and then back to Washington to find 2 other presidents who had any sense of what it must have been like to walk in the shoes of FDR. But tools of leadership. FDR was collegial, calm, empathetic. FDR was a masterful communicator in an era when, a tweet was something a bird did. There was no internet, there was no television. Using very primitive radio networks, he captivated and inspired the nation with his fireside chats. And, people don't appreciate this about FDR. He was also a master of detail. You would hope any American president could name the 50 states, 50 state capitals, 50 governors, right? FDR could name every county in the United States. There are 3,000 counties in the United States. He could tell you the county seat. He could tell you the head of the Democratic Party in every one of the counties. He was a master of detail. And lastly, a consummate team builder. He was someone who could get Joseph Stalin working with Winston Churchill and putting up with Charles de Gaulle. He was really a remarkable leader. And as I look around the world today, it's a mix. There are some great leaders. Nobody approaches that FDR scale. One that I admire a lot is bottom center is Angela Merkel of Germany. But we could talk through every one of these leaders. They're all kind of pieces and parts of the FDR model. I think what matters for us at this moment is, what is this team going to be like, and what kind of tools are they going to use? And I'll give you three major ones that I think, and then we'll open it up for some questions and comments. I think the Biden team, first of all, and this may surprise you, is going to be innovative. Kind of the rap on them already is, they've already had these jobs. It's just going to be Obama 3. I don't think so. This is an innovative group of people, and innovation, can be small things like Post-its. It can be coming up with big moonshots, bottom right. It can be, kind of crazy ideas like putting airplanes on ships. Who thought of that, 100 years ago? I think this team's going to be pretty innovative. And, the innovations they will push and are going to happen, I think are going to be biological. This entire year is going to give great lift to biotech, sequencing the human genome, immunotherapies, all of that. It's also going to drive innovation in the defense and military sphere. This is a team that understands the power of artificial intelligence in defense, in cyber, understands unmanned vehicles, understands the power of elite special forces. That's a SEAL team, Trident on the left, understands the vitality of space, hypersonic. So look for this team to be very innovative in that sphere. And then finally, the thing we're all experiencing, innovation in day-to-day life, upper image there, telemedicine, center right, ding, 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 what we're doing right now. It's going to take a big jump. And, I spent 5 years as dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, the oldest and the first graduate school of international relations in the nation. Fletcher this year has jumped into this teleeducation sphere. Many will follow. And bottom left, I'm down in Florida coming to you, so I'm still wearing shorts down here. So this kind of basket, this spectrum of innovation is going to give this team a real set of opportunities, and I think you'll take advantage. So innovation. Secondly, communication. This is a team that values positive, powerful, consistent communication. And here's a news flash. Communication isn't what happens with a megaphone, bottom left. Communication is a bridge. It goes back and forth. You got to know the sea that you're swimming in. You got to listen as well as you transmit. And I think this Biden team, all these actors understand that. And by the way, none of them are seeking to be the top dog. The folks Biden is picking so far are like a 1980s Celtics basketball team where everyone's trying to make everyone else on the team look good. No one's trying to be the leading scorer. Everyone wants a team to succeed. And by the way, this also may surprise you. I think the Biden team is going to be surprisingly capable in this world. Now you're looking at this and thinking, okay, retired admiral, are these shipping lanes or airline route? What is this? Hey, this is Facebook, social networks. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. And the tell, if you're a poker player, is that China is dark. The Biden team is going to aggressively and I think very effectively be using the social networks in positive ways. So innovation, communication, and third and finally, collaboration. As I mentioned, this is a team that really works together well. And I do want to make a point, though. This is not a team of 8 guys in a rowing shell, everybody doing the exact same motion. This is a team more like this. It's a peloton. And these young ladies, they're competing, but they're collaborating, and it's messy. And sometimes people fall down and then they rejoin the race, or maybe they don't. But collaboration and teamwork, I think, will be a hallmark here. And it'll manifest in better relationships with our formal allies like NATO. It'll be more coalitions. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. About 88 nations are in this. By the way, the Trump administration did a good job putting this coalition together and running it. It started under the second Obama term, but it was very much a strong suit under President Trump. The Biden team will be very coalition oriented. And then lastly, they will want to work with these international organizations across the top. And, if you think about it, those international organizations, I think of them kind of like those old Chevys running around Havana Harbor. And, frankly, they were all built at about the same time in the 1950s, but they're still on the road. They're still effective. Do they need, a tune-up, a new paint job? Yeah. And, maybe you want to give them an electric battery to bring them into the modern times. But those organizations are still very capable. And I think you'll see the Biden team immediately rejoin the World Health Organization, for example. I think they'll strongly seek a leadership role in the Paris Climate Accords. I believe those are good things you'll see from this team. So all this will be, there'll be basis in values: democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. We execute those values imperfectly, God knows, but they are the right values. And I think you'll see this team seek not to jam those down anybody's throat, but to embody those values. It's hard work. I can't say I envy the Biden team, the task ahead. There's a quality of Sisyphus to it. And, I'm a Greek American. You probably guessed that, a name like Stavridis. And so I'm required to have a Greek image from mythology in every presentation. Here it is. This is a team that also is resilient, led by a man, Joe Biden, who defines resilience. As a young politician, his wife and baby daughter killed in a car accident. At the other end of his political life, his beloved son, Beau, dies of brain cancer. I mean, he is a resilient leader, and I think his team will reflect that. And they got to go fast. I mean, there's a lot bubbling in that international world, so they're going to have to move out quickly. The key is going to be like a cheetah, and look at the physiognomy of this animal. This is the fastest thing on Earth. It can go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. It's made for speed. It's got a narrow head. It's got powerful front legs, big lungs to process oxygen, massive back legs. Oops, wait a minute. If you were creating the fastest thing on Earth by evolution or creation, take your pick, why would you give it a tail the size of one of its legs? Why doesn't it have like a little bunny tail or no tail to reduce drag? And the answer is it needs the tail to stay in balance, because when it turns, moving at 60 miles an hour, it can counterbalance itself with that tail. So the moral of the cheetah is you got to go fast as hell, but you got to stay in balance. Last image, and then I'll look at Q&A for some questions. I love this photograph. It was taken about 5 years ago. These are Somali migrants. They're standing on a beach on the Red Sea. And prosaically, what's happening in this photograph? They're raising their cell phones, trying to get a better signal. Metaphorically, what's happening in this picture is that they are reaching for the light. This is a picture of hope. These migrants are hoping to get to the next stage of their journey. They're hoping to join the light, the greater world. So my last line for you as we wrap up the presentation is a quote. And I love to quote Napoleon. You can't see me right now, but I'm like 5 feet, 5 inches tall on a really good day. I'm hardly that towering, legendary admiral from Central Casting. So because I'm short, I like to quote Napoleon, because short people have to stick together at all times. And Napoleon said, remember this, Napoleon said, a leader is a dealer in hope, not in fear. A leader is a dealer in hope. I think that's the kind of team we've got coming in here. So I'm cautiously optimistic about how our nation makes this turn and heads into 2021. Plenty of challenges ahead. But for all of you, wherever you are in our NFP universe, share that idea, share that sense of hope and optimism. Like Napoleon said, be a leader who's a dealer in hope. Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you. If you want to follow up on any of these social platforms, please join me. And I will open up Q&A. I see a few questions are popping in there already. And let me start taking a few questions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, let me start with this one. Noting that COVID doesn't respect national borders, do you anticipate a greater collaboration with international organizations like the World Health Organization? Yes. As I said, look for this Biden team to want to engage at every level. Take NATO, for example. As if Michelle Flournoy is the next Secretary of Defense, she has a long, long track record of working with NATO. Tony Blinken, who's going to be the Secretary of State pending confirmation, all these are pending confirmation, is a strong proponent of working with the United Nations. Susan Rice, who will certainly emerge as a significant advisor, was the finalist to be the vice president. Susan Rice, former ambassador to the United Nations. So yes, I think we're going to see a great deal of collaboration with international organizations. And they are not perfect. They are going to make mistakes, the international organizations, but like those Chevys at Havana Harbor, they're still on the road. And I think we would be better served working with them effectively than walking away from them. Okay, next up. How do you think Kamala Harris will define the role of VP and fit into the team? From what I see so far, it seems she will be more involved than we've seen in a VP, and Joe Biden is purposefully bringing her to the forefront. I think that analysis is about right. Clearly, the chemistry is good between the two of them. I think you'll see President Biden kind of hold the international, the security portfolios, the diplomacy portfolios. I think he will look for Vice President Kamala Harris to be a leading voice in the national conversation about social justice. She's, of course, has a prosecutor's background, but herself is African-American and Indian-American. So I think she'll be very effective in that role going forward. Let's read one here from Joe Esparraguera. I would think our future relationship with China will not follow the US versus Soviet historical line. The Chinese clearly understand that conflict interferes with business. There was no such line of thought in dealing with the Soviet Union, where he had almost no trade at all. Chinese seem to love the dollar as much as we do. Let's hope they continue to love the dollar, Joe, because if they call in all the dollar denominated investments they have, we would have some problems. But I do agree with your fundamental theory that we can avoid stumbling into a Cold War with China and not follow that US-Soviet Union model. A couple of reasons for that. One is neither the US nor China are trying to ideologically change the governance system of the other nation. We're not trying to force democracy on China. China's not trying to force their, if you will, blended model of totalitarianism and capitalism on us. So there's not that kind of ideological difference in the Cold War. Secondly, we don't share a significant land border that could drive conflict the way that our NATO allies shared a land border with the Soviet Union and with the Warsaw Pact. And by the way, to that point, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. The Cold War was millions of troops in Europe facing each other across what was called the Fulda Gap, two massive blue water navies operating in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. In the North Atlantic, it was two massive nuclear arsenals on a hair trigger alert. None of that exists today. We still have off-ramps before the tunnel of stumbling into a war. And that's really why I chose to write a novel about a war as a kind of cautionary tale so we can avoid this. So Joe, I agree with you. I think we can avoid stumbling into it. And over the long throw of the century, I'm hopeful that our interests, which in the end are economic, will intertwine. Let us hope so. Okay, here's one from Tim McFarland. If there is a military conflict with China, what does a USA win look like? It always seemed to me that we cannot fight a conventional war with China. Would it not risk a nuclear response? Point being that the USA cannot engage militarily. I agree right up to the point about the USA cannot engage militarily. I hope you're right that we would not cross a nuclear line ever again. We've done it once. I think a military conflict with China would be very maritime in quality and character. It would be located principally in the South China Sea. And if we did stumble into some kind of a conflict, I would guess it would largely be the result of the two nations miscalculating. And that would be the great danger here. Joe has popped back up with a point, and that's you don't mention India as a force for the near future. Well, that's a great setup for me, Joe, in that in the novel that I write about US and China, India plays a very central role. And I would wager you this, that 300 years from now, when a historian sits down to write the definitive study of the 21st century, it won't be about COVID. It won't be about the rise of China. I think it's going to be about the rise of India. And so how quickly that occurs is hard to know and understand, but from this moment. But I think over the course of this century, India's trajectory, because of their demographics, because of their democracy, messy at times, whose isn't, because of their linkages to the West, I think India becomes a very powerful actor toward the end of this century, maybe a lot sooner. In the book 2034, I talk about that. Well, here's one from Fletcher Goldinger. How do you foresee NATO and EU relations evolving between Eastern, more Eurosceptic states, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia? Yeah, and I would add Turkey to that list of concerns. I think that throughout both NATO and the European Union, there is some concern, particularly about Poland and Hungary drifting a bit toward authoritarianism, and certainly that is the case within NATO of Turkey under President Erdogan. In all of those cases, I think we can still hold the NATO alliance together. I think we can still hold the European Union together, but it's going to require, in my view, criticizing and correcting in private, in public, trying very hard to maintain coherency across the alliance lines, using high-level delegations. I think in all of these cases, it's going to be challenging for the Biden team, because they are going to be predisposed toward putting high value on human rights, freedom of the press, freedom of education, rights for migrants, all things that I think everyone on this call would value. But it's important that we remain pragmatic and work with our allies and partners. They're not perfect, and newsflash, we're not perfect. Nations have corrective things they need to do. We ought to be having those conversations privately, but that coherence of EU and NATO, I think, are very valuable and important for all of us. Now, here's a longer question. I'm going to try and boil it down a bit. It's from Dan Solomon, and it's about Iran. As you pointed out, Iran is on pause, hoping for a return. Normalization of relationships in the Middle East presents more unified front. Yes. Saudis are waiting for the new administration to formalize. I think that's right. Do you believe the Biden administration will work to return to the old paradigm for getting Iran's leadership closer to the West, or continue the maximum pressure applied? Yeah, this is a great question, Dan, and I think is going to be the first hard decision for the Biden administration. Some of the easy ones are things like rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, rejoin the World Health Organization, give a boost to NATO, go to Japan and talk about the US-Japanese relationship. I think there are a number of easy decisions out there. This is a hard one. I'll tell you what I think they should do, and then I'll tell you what I think will happen. I think they should not immediately jump back into the old nuclear deal. I think things have changed. As the gypsies say, the carnival has moved on. And the differences are that the Iranian economy is under extreme duress. COVID has impacted Iran badly. Iran is not in a strong negotiating position. So I think our best course of action would be to say to the Iranians, hey, that old deal, look, we're not going to debate whether it was a good deal or a bad deal. It's a dead deal. Let's cut a new deal, and we'll give you some sanctions relief up front, carrot, stick. But if you don't come to the table, and if you don't stop enriching, and if you don't stop amassing quantities, then we are not going to be able to do this negotiation. And, we're going to find ourselves in not a good position with you. So I would take a pretty tough line with them. I think for the Biden team, they are pretty invested in getting back into that deal. And I suspect what they're going to do is go back into the deal, give some level of sanctions relief, but then say to the Iranians, to get the rest of the sanctions relief, you have to come back to the negotiating table. I'll close on this by saying the key here is not Tehran. The key is Brussels. All roads to Tehran lead through Brussels. And what I mean by that is if you can put the United States in a coherent position with our European allies, you have a much better chance of influencing Tehran. And last thought, the other new wind sweeping through the Middle East, and your question mentions it, is the growing alignment between Israel and the Gulf Arabs. That's going to continue. I agree with your assessment. The Saudis would be crazy to hand President Trump a gift on the way out the door. He's going to wait. He, the Crown Prince, will probably wait and do that after the inauguration. So bottom line, it's going to be bumpy in the Middle East, but I don't think the Iranians are in a position to want to really start another conflict. And therefore, the Biden team will have some reasonable leverage. I'm cautiously optimistic this can be worked out. Certainly, it's going to be a complicated set of problems. And I'd put this at the top of the worry list for the incoming president. Folks, I'm going to have to stop there. I want to just conclude with a thought. People ask me a lot about gridlock in the United States and what can we do about gridlock in our country, which is hurting us in so many different ways. And I think the answer is we can celebrate service. And here I don't mean just, saying to a military person, thank you for your service. I mean celebrating all those who serve the country, including our police, our firefighters, our diplomats, our Peace Corps volunteers, our military for sure, our EMTs, our doctors, our nurses, our teachers. There's a lot of people serving the country. I think service is bipartisan, it's nonpartisan. We ought to celebrate that. Number two is education. We ought to invest more and more and more in education, particularly helping people understand what's real and what's maybe not so real on the internet. That's an educational process. And then third and lastly, I think as voters, we ought to be looking for candidates who want to reach across the aisle, who want to break down barriers, who want to help end the gridlock. Those decisions are up to all of us individually. There's three ideas for you. Above all, I hope you have a joyous season of light, whatever your faith is. And I hope that we can all put 2020 in the rear view mirror soon. Thank you very much. And now I'll pass it back to Matt and Eric. Thanks so much.
Thank you again, Admiral, for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us today. To reiterate, we did record today's presentation and you can expect to receive that shortly. That concludes our webinar for today. So we hope that you will join us next week for the remaining webinars in the series. And thank you everyone for joining us and have a great day.
Matt, by the way, if anybody didn't get their question answered, send me an email. Real easy, james.stavridis@gmail.com. Happy to answer on email. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Admiral.